In this tutorial, we'll take a look at making exposure corrections and adjustments inside DaVinci Resolve. Now, prior to the release of Resolve 17, we had a few manual methods of making exposure corrections and adjustments inside the application. So we had access to the Curves panel on the color page, where we could make the curves adjustments as required. And we also had access to the color wheels, where we could adjust the gain, gamma, and lift based on our exposure requirements. Now, the downside to these methods is that they've required a lot of visual feedback, and they haven't always been an accurate method of making exposure adjustments. We have had other methods of making exposure adjustments, such as the exposure correction plugin, where you can make the adjustments in exposure values from -10 to +10. And with the introduction of Resolve 17, there's now an HDR panel where we can make the similar adjustments on the exposure controls. So let's have a look at a non-color managed workflow first of all. So we've set our color signs to DaVinci YRGB and our timeline color space to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. And if we have a look at this clip here, it's already been recorded using the Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 setting. So all we really need to do is make slightly minor adjustments just to align it based on the Gamma 2.4 output. We do also have the exposure setting adjustments for the shadows, midtones, and highlights as well. However, it's probably preferable to make the adjustments at the global level rather than at the individual level. Now let's switch over to a color managed workflow. So if we go into DaVinci YRGB Color Managed, and the first preset that we've got is SDR Rec 709 with an output to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. And we've got a number of clips here. The middle clip in this is currently set to exposure 0. And the clips preceding that are 1 stop underexposed and 2 stops underexposed. And the clips after that are 1 stop overexposed and 2 stops overexposed accordingly. So if we go into our first clip that's 1 stop underexposed, we simply make the adjustment by adding 1 stop here. And it's already added the stop. But if we have a look at our main clip, we can see that there's a discrepancy between the two. And they don't quite align properly. And the reason behind that is in Resolve 17, unfortunately, we've also got some behind-the-scenes activities happening with regards to gamut and tone mapping. So if we go into our custom setting, we can see that there's an input DRT and an output DRT. Because our footage was shot in a log format, Resolve will automatically try to adjust the settings so as to bring the log footage down to a Rec 709 color space and gamma. However, there are some downsides to this method, and a few settings inside Resolve don't quite work properly with the input DRT set to DaVinci. So if we go in and adjust our input DRT to none, and go back to our clips here, we can see that they're fairly close, but again, not quite there. And the reason behind this is that there appears to be a bug in the current version of Resolve, where if the timeline is set to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4, some of the color managed settings don't function properly. So what we need to do is actually set our timeline to Rec 709 Scene. And if we go back and save that, now we can see that our clips are adjusted quite accurately. Now, to avoid all these issues at the onset, it's recommended to go into the color managed settings and set our preset to DaVinci Wide Gamut. And what this actually does is it adjusts the timeline color space and gamma to a wider color space and gamma for high dynamic range content. And because our footage was shot using a log format, Resolve will actually map that footage to align with that wider color space and gamma. So if we go back into our clips here, we can see that it looks pretty accurate as well. And let's make another adjustment here. We know that this was 1 stop overexposed, so let's bring that down by 1 stop. And we can see that the footage all looks quite normalized pretty well. Now we can also use these exposure adjustments within an ACES workflow. So if we go into ACES CC and change our input and output settings accordingly, and we can see that there's been some changes here and our footage has been mapped properly as well. Now, there are some limitations with this exposure adjustment option, the key one being that we're only able to adjust in stops from -6 to +6. And we also don't have access to this exposure adjustment setting in the Fusion tab. And if we really want to make adjustments in the Fusion tab, we'd simply need to go into our Fusion page, do whatever settings we need to do. So in this case, I'll make a transform. And we'll change the size here. We'll come back into our color page and make the exposure adjustments accordingly. Alternatively, we can also use the exposure correction plugin, which will allow us to work in both the color page as well as Fusion. So if we go in here and change our setting to ACES CC and make a 2-stop adjustment to bring that up. And similarly, if we wanted to make the adjustments in the Fusion tab, we could do that as well. So we'd set it to linear and make the necessary adjustments as required. So there you go. That was a quick overview of making exposure corrections and adjustments inside DaVinci Resolve.